Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we have been hosting the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services since 1983. This semester, our lectures are rediscovering Wisconsin, some of the people and events that make our state a great one. So today we're going to learn about Hmong in Wisconsin, and we have with us Nengher Vang. He's an associate professor in the history department at UW-Whitewater. He teaches the Vietnam War, American foreign relations and empire, U.S. immigration history, and Asian American history. He conducts research on the history and politics of Hmong Americans who came to the United States as refugees from Laos after the Vietnam War. He lived the first 4 years of his life in the Lao jungle, evading persecution by communist soldiers after the communists came to power in Laos, and the next 8 years in 2 refugee camps in Thailand before he and his family finally came to the United States in the late 1980s. Vang earned his PhD in history from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and an MA in peace studies from the University of Notre Dame. Please welcome Nengher Vang.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie, for that introductions. And also, I wanted to say thank you to all of you as well for coming out to this presentation as well. This is the second time that I'm doing this lecture here. The last time that I was here, we did a lecture on Hmong cosmology and religion. And so I thought, this time we'll focus on the history, not the cultural part or not the religion and cosmology, but we'll focus on the history. And so what I wanted to do is give you a sense of who they are, right? How they came to this country and so on, right? And so, again, thank you. I mean, it's a beautiful day outside. You could have been spending your day outside, like enjoying the beautiful weather, but you're inside, for this presentation. So, thank you again for coming. I wanted to begin this presentations with some numbers, right? So, in the state of Wisconsin, we have roughly 55,000 Hmong Americans. The numbers, right, decreases by maybe a 400 or 500 or so, 900 or so, right, since 2013. Right? But again, still roughly 55,000 in the state of Wisconsin. In the United States, the population increases to about 327,000, right? But Wisconsin remains the state with the third largest populations. And so, again, still sizable number of populations in the state of Wisconsin here. In terms of the distributions, they are still sort of scattered, right, in multiple counties. But and largely with Milwaukee, you can see, let's see, Marathon County, Walsall in particular, and then Dane County, so Eau Claire, Sheboygan, and so on, right? And so again, Hmong populations in the state of Wisconsin, it's largely scattered in multiple, counties here in the state. Again, the largest is still very much Milwaukee. Right? In Dane County, we probably again still have roughly 4,000 to 5,000 people, right? So, and mostly in Madison. I should say we don't have anybody in Whitewater. We used to, right? We used to have one person, one resident. He was a faculty on the Whitewater campus. He taught in computer science, but then probably, let's see, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, he got a different positions in St. Paul, and so he left. And so now we do not have any Hmong Whitewater residents, unfortunately. And so we do have a sizable number of students on campus, but again, they are coming from other places in Wisconsin to Whitewater, but we don't have any resident in Whitewater as of right now. And so, again, for today, what I wanted to do is give you a sense of who they are, right? Who are the Hmong people, how and why did they come to the United States and to Wisconsin, and then how have they adjusted to life in Wisconsin, okay? And so this is a people who trace their origins all the way back to China, right? So the origins, they came from what's now north of Beijing, some 5,000 years ago. So a long, long, long history, if you will. And again, what I'm doing today is basically, I'm going to try to give you a 5,000 year history in about 40 or 30 minutes or so, right? So again, right, they trace the origins all the way back to 3,000 year BC into today's Beijing, right, north of Beijing. And some scholars are saying that they were the first rice cultivators in the regions and possibly in the world as well, right? And so from China, they migrated to Southeast Asia in the late 18th century, largely because of persecutions back in China and tax oppressions in China and so on. And so they were fleeing from persecutions in China, but then also looking for new land, right? New land in Southeast Asia. And so they migrated to places like Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, not Cambodia, but Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. And Burma, I should say, or Myanmar nowadays. Dr. Yang Dao, Dr. Yang Dao is the first Hmong person to receive a PhD. And so he got his PhD from France in 1972, and he estimated that Hmong arrived in Laos between 1810 and 1820. And so when they arrived in Laos, they were basically living in very high altitude, right? 3,000 to 5,000 feet altitude, way up in northern Laos. They lived in small villages, very isolated villages, away from the rest of the lowland Laos or the other ethnic groups in the country. They engage in what we call subsistence farming, and what that meant is that they were largely planting and growing crops for family consumptions during the year. So they plant things like rice, corn, cucumbers, and so on. Right? They didn't plant what's called cash crop until the French came much later. After the French colonized the regions, including Laos, they would eventually end up planting what they call cash crop. Right? And what that meant is that they were largely planting opium, right? Opium, yeah. Okay, and that's because they couldn't pay their taxes. You see, so when the French came, they developed this. They had what they call an indirect colonial system in Laos, and so they elevated or they brought in the Vietnamese and the ethnic Lao to be the intermediary between the French at the top and the minorities at the bottom, or the minorities like the Hmong at the bottom. And so the ethnic Lao and the ethnic Vietnamese were the ones who came to collect taxes from the people. When they came to collect taxes, they would collect one portion for the French at the top, but then one portion for themselves. And so the people at the bottom ended up paying double, sometimes triple taxes. And so when they couldn't pay taxes, the French then advised them to plant opium, right? That's a cash crop. You can sell opium and get, cash to pay your taxes. And so they would eventually switch to doing cash crop agriculture. But for a long, long time, they enjoyed this relatively peaceful, autonomous life away from the other ethnic groups, away from the lowland Lao, until French colonized Laos in the late 1800s. And so for the next 6 decades, right, French colonized Laos in 1893, and so for the next 6 decades, they lived under French colonial rule. And again, there's a lot of transformations or changes that took place during the 6 decades. There's some resistance or rebellions against the French. There were some collaborations with the French or aiding the French in maintaining the colonial systems in the country. But as you and I know, French were finally forced to leave Indochina after they were defeated in Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. So I'm going to come quickly to the U.S. part. And so when we think about U.S. interest in Laos, U.S. really had very little interest in Laos to begin with prior to 1954, right? The focus before 1954 was largely on Vietnam. French was critical, right, at the end was critical of the French presence in Southeast Asia, right? They didn't want the French to go back after World War II to recolonize Indochina. And the main criticism was that they didn't do a good job in terms of preparing the people for independence, right? And so U.S. was critical, but again, the focus was largely on Vietnam, not so much Laos. We had, before 1954, one American Foreign Service officer in the country, but there was really no embassy. The guy was there taking notes, writing field notes and sending it back to the State Department. By 1955, however, right, Laos would become a key domino in the region. It was considered the key domino in the region. And so beginning in 1955, United States created this program called Program Evaluation Office in the country. And so on the surface, it seems like it's a humanitarian mission, right? Providing humanitarian aid to local people and so on. But the office was staffed entirely with retired military officers. And so they were training local people to fight communist insurgency or suppress communisms in the country. So by 1961, when Kennedy came to office, President Eisenhower said to Kennedy, you have to do everything possible, right, to keep Laos from falling in the hands of communism. If Laos falls to communism, the entire regions will fall to communism, right? You will see a domino effect in Southeast Asia. And so Laos was very strategic, was very important. But from the U.S. perspective, we had a problem, right? Or we have an obstacle. And so we signed the Geneva Accord in 1954 that says Laos was supposed to be a neutral country, right? And we will have no foreign intervention in that country. And so we had, on the one hand, the 1954 Geneva Accord that says, look, we can't be sending troops into Laos, right? We operated, we had retired military officers training the people under the Program Evaluation Office since 1955, but again, we would not be sending troops into the country. And so, but then we have political military objective or goals or interest in that country. And so how do we go around that? We engage in secret operations using the CIA. And so the relationship between the Hmong and the Americans began with this very historic meeting between this CIA agent by the name of James William Lear, but largely known as Bill Lear, and the Hmong leader at the time, right, Major Vang Pao. He was a major in the Royal Lao Army at the time. Now, he would eventually get promoted to general by the end of the war, but at this particular point, he was a major in the Royal Lao Army. And so from that meeting, they decided that they would create a secret army, right, and call SGU, or Special Guerrilla Units. And so they began then to recruit Hmong into that SGU. And so initially you got a few hundreds in there, but then eventually you get more and more into that. And so initially you get people who volunteer, right, to enlist in the SGU, but then eventually the people got killed, and so they eventually conscript people into SGU as well. And also, right, during as the war progressed, you get more and more people killed, and so how do you replace the number of soldiers, or the soldiers who were killed? They eventually ended up recruiting very young people into the army. So you can see images like here, right? People very young, 12, 13, 14, old enough to carry a gun. And so they now join SGU. And so at the height of the war, again, 1969 or so, there were about 40,000 Hmong soldiers in SGU. Right, and they ended up basically carrying a variety of task and missions. They were protecting American radars and providing intelligence and enemy operations in the country, disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through Laos here, engage in direct combat on the ground. But most of them were also trained. Many of them were also trained to be pilots, and so they carried out bombing missions as well. Right, so here, for Hmong pilots, for American pilots, they were sent home after a year in Southeast Asia, or if they flew over Vietnam after the 100th mission, right? But Hmong pilots flew until they were killed. And so you get the most famous Hmong pilot, Li Lu, right, flying more than 5,000 missions before he was shot and killed. And so they really served, right? They served, or until they were killed. And so we recently have a professor, Nengher Vang, professor at UW-Milwaukee, publishing this book, Fly Until You Die, an oral history of Hmong pilots in the Vietnam War. So if you're interested in that, that's a good book to get. Now, during the war, one of the other impacts that we see the American war in Southeast Asia for Hmong is that the war somehow, right, provided educational access to Hmong girls for the first time. So prior to this point, you get largely Hmong boys going to school. Not that every boy, was going to school. It's only the people who were, sort of upper class or elite, who could afford to send their children to school. But for the very first time, we see Hmong girls going to school during the war. And many of them were trained to become nurses during the war. And so, and this is all with the funding from the United States, right? With the funding from the Americans. In spite, right, of the fact that we spend really millions and millions of dollars in the secret war, in the war in Laos, the war was largely it's now known as the secret war because it's not known to the public until really the late 1960s, right, 1969, 1970 or so, when you get a journalist in Laos. He happened to stumble upon some of the soldiers or some of the secret soldiers. And so he wrote about it, and then all of a sudden it's talked about in Congress. But before that point, they wanted to keep this a secret operations. And so we spend lots and lots of money in that country, right, funding the Hmong people, that whole operations. But then in the end, again, we signed a peace agreements to basically end the war in 1973. And so in Laos itself, they also signed their own peace agreements in February 1973. And so this agreement was signed between the Communist Party Lao, that's headed by this guy, right, Suphanawong, and supported by the Vietnamese, Viet Minh, and then the Royal Lao government that was supported by the United States and the Hmong. So they signed the peace agreements, and so after they signed the peace agreements, United States then withdrew from Southeast Asia, right? American troops came back, and U.S. stopped funding, right, Hmong people in the country, and so without U.S. funding, they couldn't continue to fight. And so a couple years later, right, 2 years later, communists came to power in that country, taking over Laos. And now I should say, right, that they came to power in Laos on May 15, 1975. But just, 6 days earlier, right, the communists declared in their official newspaper that they were going to exterminate the Hmong people to their roots, right? And they use this term. See, it's MEO, right? It's not Hmong, but it's male, right? And so it's a derogatory term. It's almost like maybe using the N-word for African Americans, right? So they said, the male must be exterminated to their roots. And then just one day before the communists came to power, we had the last evacuations of all Americans from Laos, right, taking place from Long Teng Air Base. And so you get a massive number of Hmong people going to Long Teng Air Base, flooding this place, hoping to be airlifted with the Americans to safety. Right? And in the end, we got about maybe 2,500 people, right, on board with the Americans, and they were airlifted to safety in Thailand. Okay, now let's see if I can play this clip and give us some visuals here too. Oh, how do we do? Okay, let's do that. I think it should be here, right? There you go.
Peace, not war. I want to make it clear to the American people and to all the world that all we want in Laos is peace, not war. A truly neutral government, not a Cold War pawn.
tế của chú chân mà em thấy bao là tại ôn một cái in đại ca là của mình nhiều cái in đại ca thì nó vang chế thật là
有比草肉的呢，这个有多大肉？
nó tôi thấy mẹ cột lâu nữa tàu cũng gì lúc có tơ để lúc rõ mông nữa một đồng cha u ti đã ca chơi luôn đồng đồng cha cú quá nó còn đi sao em đâu lấy trong chơi.
The Lao Communist government essentially declared genocide on the Hmong. They came to every Hmong village that they thought supported the U.S. and slaughter and burn down and rape everyone in that village.
Okay, so we got some visuals there. So again, they declare that they wanted to exterminate the Hmong people, and so that's why you get massive number of people going to Longjiang, hoping to be airlifted with the Americans to safety. But then in the end, high-ranking officers and general rank power were airlifted. You get the rest basically left behind. You maybe last year or maybe a couple of years ago, you see the chaotic evacuations and flight of people in Kabul. Right, and so that reminds Hmong Americans, of their experience in Longjiang in 1975. So the consequences that we get eventually more than 100,000 Hmong fleeing the country, right, trying to escape from persecutions back home. They became refugees in Thailand. They basically crossed the Mekong River, crossed the border to Thailand. And so between 1975 and 1990, we have roughly over 100,000 Hmong refugees already. And then from there, they'd eventually come to the United States and some other countries like France, Australia, Canada, and so on. But the majority of Hmong refugees ended up in the United States. And so U.S. Response to Indo-Chinese refugees, the very first act that we got, or a law that we got in response to the flow of Indo-Chinese refugees is the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act in 1975. And under that act, the preference was given to Cambodian refugees and Vietnamese refugees. And so Lao refugees were included too, but Hmong refugees were excluded. And so in the same year, President Ford approved this plan to resettle Hmong permanently in Thailand. Right? So the 1975, again, the plan was to bring Vietnamese and Cambodians, refugees and lowland Lao refugees to the United States, but Hmong were excluded. And I'll tell you sort of why in a few minutes. And so 1976, the law was amended to include Hmong refugees. And so it took some political maneuvering and advocacy in D.C. for Congress to eventually amend the act to include Hmong refugees. And so in 1975, the official mentality or thinking at the time was that Hmong refugees were too primitive for resettlement in the United States. And so and so they were not including Hmong refugees in 1975 because their thinking is that Hmong people were too primitive to come to this country. Right? So you get, say, for example, Lionel Rosenblatt, president of Refugee International, who was working with resettling Hmong refugees or Indo-Chinese refugees coming to this country, testifying that senior U.S. officials who felt that it was good enough for them, for Hmong to fight for our country, United States, also felt that they were too primitive to come to this country. And even in the 1990s, we still have newspaper reports describing Hmong people as really the most primitive refugee group coming to America. Okay. And so in 1975, when we look at the number of people who were admitted to America, in 1975 we have 300, right? And here, 300, largely people like Vang Pao and high-ranking military officers who worked very closely with the CIA at the time. They spoke English, and so they came, they survived just fine, they assimilated to American society just fine. And so after that, then you get people like Lionel Rosenblatt, right, going back to Congress and basically said, look, these people survived just fine. You know, they were not too primitive for resettlement in the United States. And so it took some political advocacy and maneuvering for them to change the law in 1976 to include Hmong refugees. And so you see in 1976, 3,000. By 1980, you have 27,000 coming in that 1 year. Now, in 1980, we also passed the Refugee Act in 1980 as well that says, look, you can basically sponsor, right, your families to come for the purpose of family reunification. And so initially, between 1975 and maybe 1980 or so, the people who came under resettlement policies or programs set up by the United States. But they were largely sponsored by religious organizations or social organizations, right? Or nonprofit organizations, I should say. And so, but by what happened now? Okay, but by 1980, right, Hmong in the United States then turn around to basically sponsor, right, their families or relatives or family members to come. And so since then, you get more and more coming after 1980. And I should say that's a picture of me in the refugee camp, right? That was taken in the refugee camp. And so this is me and my brothers before we came to America. And so this picture was taken in the second refugee camp. And so the way that we do this is that you initially were placed in the first camp. Once you found a sponsor, right, that's going to sponsor you for resettlement in the United States, and they transfer your family to this other camp, right, sort of a transitional camp. And so it's in the second camp that we went through health screening, right? So they would do health screening for maybe, not COVID, but things like opium and things, other, TB and some other things, right? And so once you go through the health screening, physical exams, there's also a cultural sort of orientation program as well. So the parents or the adults, they go through a cultural orientations where they learn how to use refrigerator, or they use how to use the toilet, or things like that. And then the children will go through a basic education program. And so I learned my ABC, my alphabets in the camp, this second camp. Or you learn basic conversations like, hi, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. And you, and that sort of thing, right? And so after you spend maybe anywhere between 6 to 9 months, then, and if everything goes well, all the paperwork, all the documents are processed, then you would then be coming to America. And so this is a picture of me and my brother, right? In the second camp, right before we came. This is our best clothes. And so once United States decided to accept Hmong refugees into America, then they also then implemented this policy that's known as a policy of dispersal. And what that meant is that they wanted to scatter or disperse Hmong refugees all over the place, right? All over the place. And so in the end, they ended up dispersing or scattering Hmong in, 25 different states and 53 different cities. Right? And so you have John Fink, who was a resettlement refugee officer, saying this, that the intention of this policy is to spread Hmong refugees like a thin layer of butter so that they would disappear. And so what that means is, let's say, say for example, if they send, let's say maybe 20 families to Whitewater, right? All of a sudden, local residents gonna be alarmed by the presence of, Hmong refugees in Whitewater. But if you send one Hmong family to Whitewater, right, then they basically just become invisible. They disappear, if you will. No one will be alarmed by their presence in Whitewater. And so that's the idea. And so they send Hmong refugees to Dallas, Houston, big cities too, I should say, not cities like Whitewater, big major cities like Dallas or Houston or Seattle, Portland, Philadelphia, big cities like that, so that they will basically be invisible in those cities. But then eventually, Hmong did what sociologists call a secondary migration. And what that meant is that they basically pack up their belongings and moved to be reunited with their family or to go to some other place, right? So from their initial place of settlement to some other cities. And so in 1980, we have 70% of Hmong refugees in 12 different states, right? But by 2015, 83 were concentrating in just 3 states. By probably now, 85, 80, probably around that number, still concentrating in just 3 states: California, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And again, Wisconsin still is the state with the 3rd largest Hmong populations. And so the secondary migration took place, right, largely for family reunification. And so families were scattered, right? So say, for example, if I come to this country, I'm married, I have children, then they consider me and my wife and children as a separate family or one household. My parents and my siblings who are still single or unmarried will be considered their own separate household. So my parents and my siblings could be sent to Portland, Oregon, for example, and I could be sent to Dallas, right? And so the secondary migration took place largely because they eventually found out, hey, you know what? My parents were sent, to this other state, and I'm right here, and so they'd eventually move to be reunited with family, right? And so, but they came to Wisconsin in particular because of jobs. Right, job opportunities. And so in spite of the fact that we have, freezing weather, right, lots of snow in Wisconsin, compared to Southeast Asia, you do not get any snow in Southeast Asia. It's hot and warm in Southeast Asia throughout the year and so on. They still come to, Wisconsin, right, because of jobs. And so in the 1980s and 1990s, we had certainly lots and lots of manufacturing companies or jobs in Wisconsin, and so they moved to Wisconsin largely for that purpose. That migration to Wisconsin was accelerated in the 1990s under the welfare reform bill. Right, so after welfare reform was passed, many of them came to Wisconsin for jobs. Now, when they first came to Wisconsin in the 1970s and 1980s, early 1980s and mid-1980s, I should say even, they faced a lot of discriminations by local families or local residents. And so in this particular study by Roger Mitchell, right, he looks at Hmong refugees in Eau Claire and also in particular, or Stevens Point. And he says that in the 1980s, right, there were a lot of anti-Hmong rumors. They were saying all kinds of things about Hmong families in Eau Claire and Stevens Point and Warsaw. They were saying that Hmong were stealing and eating the neighbors' dogs or exploiting the welfare systems. They were breeding like rats just to be on welfare. All kinds of, rumors about Hmong refugees in Eau Claire and Stevens Point and Warsaw and so on. Jeremy Hein, who was a professor at the UW-Eau Claire, also did a similar study, and he said that Hmong and Eau Claire and Stevens Point and other places were also very much experiencing what he called interpersonal discrimination. Right? That is, they were receiving poor services in local stores, experiencing physical harassment, they get getting assaulted, physically assaulted, or get people throwing objects at them and so on. Police mistreatment, largely because police suspected their young people or youth, right, in gang activities, and that when there's a call when there's a domestic situation taking place, police came prepared to basically shoot the abuser, and so. But since then, I should say, right, since then, Hmong have overcome a lot of the barriers, right, a lot of the challenges that they encounter, in the 1980s and even 1990s. And so since then, you get an increased number of people going to college and graduating from college and universities and going to graduate schools and so on. And so we see this in the state of Wisconsin, an increasing number of people getting higher educations and and graduate school and so on. Similarly, we see the same thing in terms of employment. So in the 1980s, when they first, or 1970s and 1980s, when they first came, they were largely depending on welfare, right? They were largely on relying on federal assistance. And so that's why you get a lot of the people, right, local residents responding to that and saying all kinds of things that they were on, breeding like brats to be on welfare, because they typically have a larger family size too, right? So like say, if in my family, I have, let's see, 6 or 6 siblings, and so Hmong families typically have a larger family size, and so that's why they were saying these people were just breeding like rats to be on welfare and things like that, all kinds of things, because again in the 1970s and 1980s when they first came, many of them couldn't read and write, they didn't speak English, they couldn't find jobs and things like that, and so they were largely on welfare, right, or depending on public assistance. But then since the 1990s, many of them got employed. They, again, part of the movement and part of the momentum or impetus is the welfare reform in the 1990s too, right? So they leave, public assistance, they leave welfare, they ended up going to work, and that's a good thing for Hmong refugees or Hmong Americans actually. And so we have an increasing number of people employed, right? And so nowadays they are in all kinds of industry, and so with great number of people or greater number of people employed, we also see in terms of income, right, an increase in income as well. And so nowadays we get Hmong opening businesses in throughout Wisconsin, right, owning business, all kinds of business in Wisconsin. And so here the number here is the blue line is the general populations, and you can see, right, that Hmong medium income, household income, it's right there with the general populations. Right? It's very comparable to the general population of Wisconsin. Household ownership, right? Home ownership, same thing, right? We see a gradual increase in home ownership. And so 1990, just 10% in Wisconsin, right? But then by 2010, we get 50% home ownership. And I imagine, right, that within the past decade, we have probably substantially more Hmong owning their own homes. And so that number is probably closer to maybe 60 or maybe 70 or more now in the state of Wisconsin. My wife is a policy analyst with the state of Wisconsin, and so she works in the Department of Children and Family, and she says, so in the past, when we talk about 1980s and so on, we'll have, again, many Hmong families depending on welfare. They were also getting child care assistance, right? But she is working in the program, and she says nowadays the reasons why there is no brochures or flyers or anything translated into Hmong anymore has to do with the fact that we do not have anyone receiving or applying for child care assistance anymore, right? And that's because so young people are going to work, but then again, no one is, very few people are still on public assistance nowadays in the state of Wisconsin, and so you get no translation of any policy or any flyers, brochures into Hmong language, largely because again, Hmong in the state of Wisconsin do not rely on those assistance as much now. And then we can also see, right, that since the 1990s, we get a number of Hmong elected to public office in the state of Wisconsin as well. And so, but largely, again, still at the local level, right, still at the local level. And so city council, school board, in various places, Eau Claire, again, places where Hmong experienced a lot of discriminations initially in the 1970s and 1980s, but then again now, a substantial number of them have been elected to public office in Eau Claire. La Crosse or in Marathon County also, and then more recently, Dane County, right? Brenda Yang being elected to Dane County supervisor there. Then Milwaukee, Krista Yang elected as a judge. And so these trends continues, and Hmong became maybe a political force in the state of Wisconsin. And so you can see the headline here in Wisconsin, right? Hmong voters could be the key to winning Wisconsin in the 2020 election that we just had. And so you get both candidates, right, coming to court Hmong voters to go and vote for them in the 2020 election. Outside of Wisconsin, we also see a similar trend, right? We get Hmong, increasing number of Hmong candidates running for office and getting elected. And so all of these people were the individuals who got elected. But we have substantially more people who campaign on every single time there's an opportunity for public office, and so lots and lots of people in Minnesota, but also California and some other states as well, getting elected to public office at the local level, but in Minnesota at the state level, and so we get people elected to the House of Representatives and also to state Senate. Right? And then Steve Lee was elected to be the mayor, the first Hmong person to be elected as a mayor in 2016 in California. And then again, in terms of industries, right? Hmong basically work in all kinds of industry, every industry we can possibly think of nowadays. The bulk is still manufacturing, right? But then they are now entering into all kinds of industry, right? Education, health, social service, arts, entertainment, finance, you name it, right? And so in the state of Wisconsin, we have a number of Hmong as professors in our UW system. And so Whitewater has two. Again, Cheng Tao used to be a professor in computer science. He left. And so now we have two Hmong professors on the Whitewater campus. So I teach in the history department, but then we also have another professor in the College of Education who is also of Hmong ethnicity or heritage. And then we have a number of Hmong professors throughout the UW systems. Eau Claire, Milwaukee, La Crosse, Oshkosh. And speaking of arts and entertainment, we have Sunisa Lee, right? Many of you are probably familiar with or have seen Sunisa Lee, but again, Sunisa was the gold medalist at the Team USA Gymnastics in Tokyo in 2021. And she went on to be one of the contestants in Dancing with the Stars. All right, so let me just make my concluding thoughts here. Considering that they were considered, right, thought of to be too primitive to come to America in the 1970s, in some ways, Hmong Americans have come a long, long way, right? Hmong in Wisconsin have also made Wisconsin their new home, created new life in the state, come a long, long way as well, right? All right, so I will stop there. Again, I did a 5,000-year history. There you go. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.